Hello 2360 students, I hope everyone is doing well. I hope that we had a good week last week. And this last couple of weeks you've learned a lot as far as embedding opportunities into the classroom. So just to recap, I want to go back and look at Module 5. I also want to apologize to everyone because I was in there working on updates for the spring. Something happened and it was changing dates in the master course. We got that figured out, so you should be able to access the content now. And because of this inconvenience that it has caused, I went ahead and allowed a 3 extra day window. So instead of the assignments being due on October 22nd, the assignment will now be due on October 25th. So that will give you 3 extra days to complete the assignment. But again, I do apologize for the inconvenience. So really we looked at those developmental skills. We looked at when we were trying to look at adaptive skills, right? We were looking at some strategies to put in support for students. We were looking at, English language learners, communication skills, task analysis. We were looking at assistive technology. So there's really a lot that we covered just alone in Module 5.1. So when we were doing the embedded opportunity, we specifically were trying to complete the matrix form, but what I wanted you to get at is the goals that you wanted to give the child, right? So when we're talking about embedding something, we were looking specifically at inside their everyday routine. So in your class schedule, how can you embed these supports for the child, right? So that's what we were looking at. So maybe your goal was during mealtime, right? And we gave you examples here of Henry. Whatever it was based on your child, right, that you could look at, you were trying to see what were the embedded opportunities. So the reason that we wanted you to do more than one goal is because realistically you will have more than one goal that you're working on for that child, right? And whenever we set a goal, we always have to make sure we monitor it, see how it's working. How are we going to collect the data? What are we going to use? So that's something that was important to know as well. But now that we did the embedded opportunity with your case study child, we are going to move into Module 6. Okay. So remember, you don't have to turn Module 5 and complete the Module 5 quiz until the 25th, but I'm going to go ahead because I don't know when you're going to watch this, and you may have already submitted the information and you want to move on to Module 6. Module 6 will still open on Monday. So really the overall goal of Module 6 is going to be looking at those social skills, right? How do they interact with their peers? How do they interact with teachers? So we know social skills is an important developmental skill that impacts students with their interactions of others as well as how they develop. So it's important for us as teachers in early childhood to remember the child's social skills. We have to support those and give them strategies to help them accomplish so they'll meet those goals. So these things, when we talk about social skills, they impact executive functions. They'll even impact self-regulation, right? So it's important for us to help those students. Now, actually all your students, but think about students who may have exceptionalities or special needs. Sometimes they exhibit some kind of challenging behavior. This could be related to their disability, not often, but most of the time it could. And sometimes it's a learned behavior, or maybe they've not been taught those things at home. So there's a lot of different reasons why this could be happening. So you are going to have to deal with challenging behavior sometimes. And whenever this child or a child has a disability, or maybe they have chronic behavior, it really starts to affect them in more than one way. So it's going to affect their ability to interact with their peers socially. It actually hinders them from accomplishing things academically as well. So if something is chronic, it means it's happening a lot, so very often, and it's starting to impact their peers, themselves, learning, everything. So whenever this happens, we say that we have to come up with an intervention, right? So the first thing that you really have to do is to recognize that the behavior of what it is, meaning what the challenging behavior is, and then we have to do something called functional behavioral assessment. Now, this is a way for us to assess so that way we can gather data to figure out what the function of the behavior is. So why is the child doing this? Are they trying to avoid something? So one thing I wanted to say is that whenever a child is, if they have a chronic behavior and they're displaying some kind of challenging behavior, most of the time they're trying to communicate something to you, right? So it's whether to avoid something or to gain something. So we have to figure out what the function is, like what's the trigger that causes this behavior. So when we do this functional behavior assessment, it allows us to get the appropriate data and collect it so we can intervene and complete what we call an intervention plan. And this is where you're going to learn about the functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plans. So remember, this is really going to be like a tiered model to support them, not only in that challenging behavior, but we want to figure out how we introduce those social skills to them and support it in a way that they understand developmentally. And then we also want them to feel confident, and we want them to also be able to replace those behaviors with something else that's more appropriate. So we want to heed off any challenging behavior for the future. So that's the overall goal of Module 6. So for your assessments, how are you going to be graded these next couple of weeks in this module? Well, we talked about how we have to conduct a functional behavior assessment, and then we have to look at implementing a behavior intervention plan. So something that you're going to be doing is you are going to look at your case study child, the one you've been working with the entire time, so the one that you gave me a overall view of their disability. Then, you did the embedded project, so we had the transition plan. So we're looking specifically at the case study child you're working with, and you're looking at implementing a behavior plan, right? So this is a project of sorts. You can't really start this behavior plan until we go through this module so we can understand what functional behavior assessment is, and then what a behavior intervention plan looks like, and what behaviors is your case study child exhibiting, and it's a problem why, and then we have to take that to do our behavior plan intervention. So you're also going to have your Module 6 quiz. Okay, so as always, I'm not going to go through this for the sake of time. I'm just going to hit the highlights for you. But if you really don't ever pay attention to this, you might want to start. I know whenever I am in class or I'm learning something new, I always want to know, like, what am I supposed to learn? What are we learning this and why? So where are we going? So it helps to have focusing questions, because these get you to think. These questions will get you to think as you're going through the module. So they're focusing you, because there's a lot of information that comes at you with these modules. So it's important for you to kind of zone in on what the most important things are. So these guiding questions and objectives help kind of narrow it down to see what you should be looking at. All right, so as always, you have your reading. These chapters have great information. This book is actually a wonderful resource. This is a newer edition that we've had. It was only brought out last year, at the end of the year, so it's up to date. So keep this book even after this class, because if you continue to work in early childhood education and special needs or an inclusive classroom, I think this is a really good resource for you. But you'll look, we're specifically honing in on what we talked about, behavior, all those challenging behaviors, and then those social skills and development of where that child should be, and how do we help facilitate that social development for the little guys. So that's reading for you. Here's vocabulary. You're going to see this vocabulary not only in your text chapters, but throughout the 6.1 and 6.2 lesson. Now, as you get in 6.1, you're going to see, again, it talks about the social development. So what are social skills and healthy emotions that the child should have? It talks about how you as a teacher can observe those skills. Then we talk about CSEFEL strategies, what that means and what it is, and how does this relate to social skills and executive functions. Again, we have executive functions here. It talks about what they are and how is it related and why it's important as supporting a child in early childhood education. And then activities to practice EF. So let's just go through quickly through each of those to point out what's important. Okay, so you'll see here when we're talking about social skills and healthy emotions, we're really talking about those broad range, like how do they interact, how are they playing, how are they relating to play and others, do they teach others, how do they learn with others. So social skills are an important part of any development level, and it's healthy for children to be able to have emotions. They understand that they have feelings of gratification and happiness, and that they understand that there are sometimes sad times or negative emotions. They need to be able to understand, have empathy, appreciate others. Okay, they need to experience joy and self-satisfaction. So there's all these skills and emotions that we considered important for them to be able to understand and go through. Now, when we're talking about social emotional intelligence, this is really talking about how typically you have the ability to have not only confidence in yourself, but you can be curious and happy and have your own thoughts and want different choices and desires. You're able to communicate things to people that you need from them. You're relating to others. You're taking social cues. You can express feelings of concern for others and yourself. So there's all these important social emotional characteristics that we should be seeing in children. Now keep in mind, this may change depending on if the child has special needs or a disability. So, but these are just giving you what typically you would see in early childhood, and it again depends on the child's milestone of where they are in their age and developmental level. So, observing social skills is important for you, right? So in our state standards, we talk about different skills and developmental that they should have at certain times that we need to help support them in. But sometimes disabilities will cause delays, right? So this could impact their communication, maybe their motor skills, whether it's fine or gross. It can in fact kind of hinder their learning because it's impacting cognition, or maybe the way that they interact or reciprocate conversations or social cues. So when we're in inclusive classrooms and you come across students who are having this social incompetence, then it's important for you to support them and put a plan in place. Now, before you can intervene, you really have to observe, right? To look for those social emotional skills and to target those skills and try to increase opportunities and to practice these skills with children, right? So that's what you're looking at. Now, when we're talking about CSEFEL, a lot of people get confused. They're like, what does that even stand for? Well, basically, it's just the Center on the Social and Emotional Foundations for Early Childhood, right? So this is really focusing on those social and emotional developmental skills and getting them ready, young children. So to kind of look at this in a visual standpoint, there's a pyramid model that helps you, right? And there's different levels of this pyramid, right? So we have universal promotion, we have secondary prevention, and tertiary intervention, okay? So whenever I look at these models, I always like to explain it like this. We have to promote social emotional development in all our children in the classroom, not just those with sectionalities. So whenever we're looking at this, whenever we're teaching them and supporting them, universal means all children. But sometimes you may have some who maybe have exceptionalities or disabilities who need some more supports or ways that you can embed opportunities for them to learn more about that. So they need a little extra support. So that's what we call secondary prevention, right? So we're trying to watch them, observe them, put things in place to make sure they get all those opportunities as much as possible so that we can heed off any problems in the future. And then even if we're doing these things and it seems like the disability is impacting this, then we have to come in and intervene, which is what we call tertiary intervention. Okay. So there's some more resources here, and I really want you to watch this video because it talks about how you could use strategies in your classroom when you're trying to teach these skills to them. It's a really great video for you to watch. Now, when we're talking about executive function and self-regulation, this is where we're talking about their performances at school. And when we talk about that, we're talking about those personal relationships, those social skills, their responses. It's hard to nail down executive function because there's not an exact science, really. You're trying to figure out and understand where their level is, right? So where are they cognitively, like with their learning and thinking? Where are they socially? And where are they in their play, like their emotional ability? So if you have child say they are like a squirrel, they have trouble with attention, maybe they have trouble with learning or behavior, this can become a problem. So it's important for us to look at specifically executive function because it can help us really narrow down and pinpoint where the breakdown is so we can support them. Okay, and even it will highlight what their strengths are and their talents, and then we can use that to help support maybe those areas of struggle, right? So here's an example of a peer playing with another child or other peers, and it's a game that they're playing. So whenever you're playing a game with your peers, you're using self-regulation, right? So maybe say this child's having a hard time waiting for her turn and playing along really well, and she's not working cooperatively. So maybe she gets mad or she takes the piece when it's not her turn, right? So that's self-regulation. She doesn't have the patience to wait. She's not waiting her turn. She's taking other people's players or taking her little game piece, and she doesn't care about anybody else's turn. Okay, she's not using self-regulation. She's also not managing her emotions. She becomes frustrated with her peers. She may act out. She may take people's paces. She may throw the pieces to the side or take her leg and scoot the board a little bit. So these are examples of not using the self-regulation as she should. So we have to put supports in place, right? So children have to have plenty of opportunities to develop these skills. So it's important for us to be able to put that in as much as possible and support them. Okay, so when we're talking about executive function, we're looking at elements, 3 specific elements. We're looking at self-control, right? What are their impulses automatically or responses to things that they interact with their peers or teachers? Are they flexible? Okay. So can they meet different demands in different situations and different rules for different places that we are in the classroom? And do they have working memory, right? So are they able to pull stuff in short periods of time, looking at short-term memory, right? Or can they have the ability to retain pieces of information over just different periods of the time throughout the day? So remember, children really are not developed. They're not born with these skills. They develop them, and they have the potential to develop them. But it's up to us to help support them. But sometimes they don't get what they need, like from their relationships, say, with their parents. Sometimes it's their environment, right? So think about any child who maybe is developing toxic stress in their life, or maybe they have neglect or abuse, or maybe violence they've experienced. Some of these things can disrupt the brain in how it works, and it impairs at that point the development of executive function. So then there's an issue. So we have to encourage parents to help build these skills at home. There has to be that home to school connection. We in our classrooms have to help promote and provide support for these children, because this is really going to help them for their whole entire life. Now, when we're practicing EF or executive function, it's important for us to realize how do we actually support not only their learning, but their development, because we know they're not born with it. So this just gives you an example of when the greatest opportunities are for us to be able to help them gain those skills. Okay, so you'll see here at the bottom of the graph you have age in years, and then over here you have a executive functional skills proficiency. Okay, so when we're looking at this graph, we're noticing that in this yellow area, this is when they're developing the most this is when they have the opportunity to develop the most, right? So you'll see probably around 6 years right here. So this is where we see visually, wow, we really have to do our job here because this is where they're gaining the most of those skills. This is the greatest opportunity before they reach age 6. So that is a great visual for you. Now, there are certain activities depending on how old they are that can help. So you'll see here you have activities for 6 to 18 months, activities for 18 to 36, or activities for 3 to 5-year-olds, or activities for 5 to 7. So make sure you go through and look at those because it's really going to give you an example of how you can help depending on what age level you work with. Then we get into lesson 6.2, and this is where we really dive deep into behavior. This is important because this is going to help you with your behavior intervention plan, right? So the first lesson, lesson 6.1, is really to dive deep into executive functions, self-regulation, developing those emotional skills, giving you examples depending on the age level of how you can support them. So now we're going to look at the behavior part. This is important because you have to do a behavior intervention plan for that case study child you're working with. So the first thing you're going to really look at in this lesson is the instructive discipline. Okay, what does that even mean, right? What is instructive discipline? Well, first off, let's break it down. Instructive is what? What is discipline, right? So this is based from an article talking about how you have instructive discipline and how it's built on understanding. So of course we have to understand the child. What's the function of their behavior? What are they trying to communicate? Okay, what kind of skills or training do they need from us in their home life to develop those executive functions, the self-regulation, those healthy emotions, self-control, character, orderness, efficiency, all these things. When we think of discipline, a lot of time the treatment that comes from discipline is to correct and punish, right? But we want to prevent challenging behaviors, right? So when we're looking at discipline, we need to look at child as a whole. How do I look at what I'm doing to reflect? That way I can see, am I the problem? Could I support this child so I can heed this behavior off? Do I actually understand what's going on? Is there a teaching moment here I'm missing? So asking yourself these questions is really going to help you start learning those replacement behaviors that you can teach, right? Like if a child doesn't know how to read, well, we teach them. If a child doesn't know how to drive, we teach. So maybe it has to do with a lot of things. Maybe it has to do with their environment at home. Maybe they've never been taught these things. Maybe they're developmentally not ready to do these. Maybe it's depending on their disability or exceptionality. So there's lots of things we have to ask ourselves, right? Can we have a teachable moment to help them and intervene? What would that plan look like? How can I support them to help them? We also look at what actually is the challenging behavior. So whenever you're looking at challenging behavior, remember, this is something at this point where it's chronic. It happens a lot, and it's starting to affect not only their peers and the teacher and the classroom environment, but it's affecting that child, right? So it's a repetitive behavior. That's what a challenging behavior is. It's a concern to teachers, parents, other people. It violates the not only the rules in the classroom, but it violates the what's the word I'm looking for? The culture in the classroom, right? Because each classroom has its own culture. The community you're building, it affects that. So it's disruptive, maybe it's disgusting, maybe it's dangerous, and you want it to be stopped, right? So that's what a challenging behavior is. Now, the pyramid model here, again, is going back to that social emotional competence that we're looking at, right? So the Center for Social Emotional Development. So when we're looking at this pyramid, what it's doing is it really looks at the type of intervention and supports in place, right? So think of it like a framework. So whenever we're looking at it, the top of the pyramid is really where you're going to be working with those children, or just those few, or even that one in your room who has that challenging behavior. Down here at the bottom is all the things that all the children are getting, right? And over here in the middle is going to be those targeted social emotional supports. So maybe you see something going on with little Johnny or Susie and you're like, and maybe you start doing those functional behavior assessments and you start doing those interaction and teaching those things to them to help them heat off so it doesn't become more of a challenging situation. And then here is where you have others that are super challenging and what you're doing here isn't working, right? So then we have to do an intervention plan. So this model really is to let you see that the top of the pyramid are really used with those who have persistent challenging behaviors. They do not respond to any typical practices or supports you put in place for them to try to stop some of those behaviors that are becoming an issue, okay? So here, most children, it works here, right, for them, but not always. And here is some extra support for you to dive deeper. I always put a lot of information here for you. A lot of this is really good resources. So even if you don't at that exact moment during those 2 weeks look at it, save it. Use it later on, right? It will help you. So this is just giving an example of the training modules for this pyramid to dive a little deeper into it. Now, a lot of schools have what we call school-wide policy behavior supports, or PBS, which is positive behavior support. So what this is an approach or a framework that they use for students in the classroom and the school. And what the school-wide policy behavior supports do is that they support all children, right? So you may have went into school, so maybe you said you have a child, or maybe you had a child long ago, wherever you are. If you've had a child in school, or you have one now, a lot of schools do what we call school-wide policies, where they'll say, be responsible, be ready, those sorts of things. And it's an overarching framework on behavior. And what that does, it has rules, right? And under that umbrella, you can talk about how we be nice to our friends, we take turns, those sorts of things. The school-wide policy behavior is meant to be a framework for all students in that school or center. Okay, so when we're looking at them, they are a little bit traditional, but when we're looking specifically at challenging behaviors, we have to put something in support, like a positive behavior support. And that specifically is going for a child who has a challenging behavior. And we want to change that behavior. So the positive behavior support works underneath the school-wide policy behavior. And what that does is it's a research-based support, and it looks at teaching that child new skills. It replaces that challenging behavior. Okay, so think of it more like a holistic approach, okay? Because it's not only impacting the child, but the peers around them, the teacher, and even their family, okay? So this research-based practice has really been a powerful approach. And it's effective with all ages, diverse groups. It doesn't matter about their culture, their disabilities, their nationality. It's very comprehensive support for them, right? So going back to case law and stuff that you've learned throughout this course so far, we know that IDEA, right, the Individuals with Disability Act, is put in place to protect those students who have maybe disabilities. And Congress amended the IDEA in 1997. So anytime you do an amendment, you add something to it, or you reauthorize, you change some things. So what they put in here was the positive behavioral interventions and supports, and they put it to include it in this special education law. And what that does is that it lets the child who maybe has disability that impacts their behavior get that support they need. So if the child has the IFSP, right, the Family Support Plan, that is going to allow us to maybe put that in their plan and support them. So they're getting all the support that they need. And there's a little short video here that talks more about like school-wide policy behavior and the level 1 tier and how that's kind of related to the positive behavior support. And one thing I did want to mention, I'll go back, in the law as well under IDEA, it states that if you have a child who has a disability or exceptionality, that if they have a challenging behavior, that you have to conduct what we call functional behavior assessment and replace them with positive approaches, right? So that way that child can be supported, and that could be one of their goals in their plan. Now, we have what we call the functional support approach. Functional approach is really looking at specific behaviors, right? So going back to that positive behavior support, the intervention that you use to support that child or that challenging behavior, we have to make sure it matches the function. So what do I mean by function? Function specifically is what the behavior is. What's the purpose of it, right? So what are they communicating to me? Why are they doing this? Okay, so whenever we look at doing an intervention or using positive behavior strategies, this is going to be a goal that you put forth for that child. So once you figure out why the child's doing it, what the function of the behavior is, then you can put strategies and supports in place that help replace that challenging behavior. That's what we call a functional approach, right? Just like if you have a child and you discipline them at home or you correct their behavior, right? Whatever they do, their consequences should match what that behavior is. Whenever we're supporting that child and we're trying to replace challenging behaviors, we have to make sure that whatever we're replacing with is going to serve that function of the behavior. So for instance, whenever we go back to saying to you that children try to communicate stuff to you with their behavior, right? So sometimes they do not have the necessary skills to talk to you to communicate what they need, right? So if they have something trying to gain or a need, they're going to communicate to you in the best way they know how, which sometimes is a challenging behavior. So when we try to figure out the function, the reason why, this chart looks specifically at primary functions of behavior, right? So it may be social thing. You have your adults here, which is the teachers, and you have your peer. You have internal sensory, tangible activities. This just gives you an overall view. Here's our concern, right? This is the challenging behavior. Are they trying to obtain something, like gain it, something they need? Are they trying to escape or avoid it? Whenever they're doing this, it's going to be, say they're trying to gain something or obtain it. Is it something from their peers, like social that they need? Is it something internal, like a sensory issue? This may be related to their disability. Is it maybe something tangible that they want, like a physical item, right? If they're trying to escape, or is it social, like attention? Maybe they need attention from their peers or other adults. The other behavior concern that they may be trying to communicate is to escape or get out of or avoid, right? So is this because it's something that they don't like? Maybe they found too challenging. Maybe they're trying to get away from their peers or you. And this, again, it can be related to their disability. We don't know. Is it an internal thing? Maybe it's auditory or too much stimulation. So these are things that really help us break down the function of the behavior. Why is this happening? And this explains more of the three categories, right? That talks more in depth about internal, sensory, social, tangible activity. Okay, so for instance, an example of tangible activity would be to identify the consequence of the behavior, right? So if they're trying to avoid a task or activity, or obtain something like assistance within a task. So before we can determine the function, we really have to collect a lot of data to support us. And then when we're trying to gather this data I'm talking to you about, one of the things that we implemented in the Education Improvement Act in the IDEA was, and they reauthorized it in 2004. So when they did that, it actually became IDEIA, right? IDEIA. But if you hear me just saying IDEA and I forget the I, it's just I'm so used to saying that. But if we're really being specific, when they reauthorized it, they put improvement in there, so then you have an I in that acronym. But one of the things that they did when they reauthorized this law is to state that now you have to conduct what we call functional behavior assessment. And this is helping us gather data, right? So we're looking at whenever a child has a disability, we're trying to replace those bad behaviors, right? You can't just discipline them. You can't just send them to alternative school or send them in a special ed room and leave them there, or the resource room. You have to figure out how to support that child. So one of the processes that you go through is conducting what we call these functional behavior assessment. So if there's a behavior displayed, say, because this is early childhood, so you probably wouldn't be on a bus, but let's just use an older kid as an example. Say an older kid is just displaying a very bad behavior or challenging behavior, and it always happens at the bus, right, in the bus or on the bus. So you can't just kick them off the bus. If they have a disability, right, or exceptionality, then it's your job, the school's job, the team, the teacher, to conduct the functional behavior assessment to figure out why this is happening. So IDEIA authorizes that you can't just kick them off or punish them or put them in alternative school without determining what that challenging behavior is. So one of the processes that you go through in collecting data, you do something called an ABC. ABC is antecedent behavior consequence analysis. I know that's a mouthful. Antecedent specifically just means trigger, right? So conducting this is really for you to determine what the behavior is, what happens right before the behavior is displayed, and what usually happens, what are the consequences that usually follows this behavior. And what this does, it gives us useful information, and it really helps us, number one, figure out the trigger. Figure out that obviously the consequence following is not helping, right? And remember that consequence, it should match, it should be a replacement, right? You should be teaching them skills to replace that target skill that you want to work on. But it's really going to help you develop what we call a hypothesis, right? A summary statement of what that behavior is, right? So antecedent, again, is a trigger. What happened in the social context of that behavior? So what set that behavior off? What was the trigger? And then the behavior itself. So remember, whenever you are describing the behavior, it has to be specific, measurable terms. Words like disrespectful or disruptive does not describe a behavior very clearly or specifically, okay? You have to make sure that you describe it in a way that anyone that would come in would understand what was happening. So instead of saying things like disrespectful, maybe you say, she told me no and threw something at me, okay? Obviously, that behavior is more descriptive than saying disrespectful. So just be mindful of when you're describing a behavior, it's very descriptive, clear, measurable, specific. And then maintaining consequences is really what are you doing when this, like what immediately follows the behavior that's displayed, right? So for instance, if you have Jack hitting his classmate during the blocks play, the classmate at this point gets up and leaves the area. So what happens when Jack hits his playmate? The playmate leaves. Think about Jack. If Jack is trying to communicate, I don't want you in the center with me, I want you to go away, I'm trying to avoid you, and you get up and leave, I get what I want. So guess what Jack's going to do every time a student comes to that play area, that block center? Going to do the same thing. Okay, so the consequence is not helping replace that behavior. Another example would be Mary throws her paper and book on the floor during math, and her teacher puts her in a timeout chair. Well, guess what? Maybe Mary's throwing her book and her paper because she's overwhelmed, and she's trying to avoid math because it's scary. Maybe it has something to do with her learning and her disability. So if she does this and the teacher puts her in the timeout chair, she's getting what she wants. She avoided math completely. So guess what she's going to do every time they do math? She's going to throw the book on the floor. Unless your consequences is really honing on, how do I replace this? How do I figure out what they're trying to do so I can support them? You're going to continue to have these problems. Okay, and there's a really neat video that talks about the ABC chart in more depth. It's really good. And then there's a paper. And this is just an opportunity to see it completed, right? So just make sure that you look at that. Okay, so we just talked about the hypothesis of function and what that was. A hypothesis of function, like I said, is just a statement, right? It's an assessment that you do, right? And when you do assessment, like an ABC analysis, you're trying to say a statement of what's going on, summarizing it. So the hypothesis, you have to develop it. Well, how do I develop it? Well, part of the problem is developing a behavior assessment, right? A functional behavior assessment and gathering data. Whenever you do the ABC analysis, this gives you a hypothesis statement. You're going to use that hypothesis statement to talk about what the triggers are, what kind of behavior is being explained specifically and descriptively, and then what kind of replacement behaviors, and does that consequence replace and match that function, right? So this is more like your best guess. Your hypothesis is your best guess, a prediction of why the child is doing what they're doing and why the behavior is continuing to happen, right? So what's the function of the behavior? So whenever you're trying to come up with a hypothesis statement, it's important for you to ask yourself these questions, right? What events, what times is this happening? What environments and with whom is around that this challenging behavior occurs? So that's the antecedent. What does the behavior look like? You're going to talk about in specific terms. What actually happens? What occurs after the behavior? So what was the consequence? Then you ask yourself, does the behavior occur to obtain something or to escape or avoid something? It goes back to when the block area, right? When other children try to play with Mary, she hits them on the arm or the face. So after she does this, the teacher scolds her and directs the peers to another center. Well, okay, let's look at this. What event consistently predicted a challenging behavior? Where and who is involved? Well, let's answer that question. As Mary plays with the blocks, another child attempts to enter the play. Okay, so this is talking about the environment, setting up the scene for what's happening. What does the behavior look like? Well, Mary hits peers on the arm and face. This is specific. This is not saying Mary's being mean to her friends. Okay, that's not giving us a clear, measurable observance of what's happening. And then ask yourself, what occurs after the challenging behavior? What does a child try to obtain or escape? Well, Mary is being scolded, and she takes the other children and moves them to a different area. Mary, she's there all by herself with the blocks. So when Mary plays, so let's look at my statement that I'm going to use, my hypothesis statement in this functional behavior analysis, right? We answer these questions. Now I need to do my best guess of what's going on. So this is what I would write. When Mary plays with blocks and another child attempts to play in the same center, Mary will hit the peer on the arm and face. The teacher will scold Mary and move the peer to another center, allowing Mary to obtain sole use of the blocks. Okay, so here I would gather, I think that Mary is trying to avoid or escape her peers. So each time the teacher does this, she's still getting what she wants. This is not replacing that behavior. That behavior will continue to happen. So we have to figure out as a team, what do I need to do to try to replace this behavior with Mary, right? So look at some of the examples here that they give you, and I'm not going to go through them for the sake of time, but I want you to really look at the examples. Look at the hypothesis up here, and look at the statement made for Mary, and then I want you to look at different examples of different kinds of things happening, different challenging behaviors. Now, after you look at those, I want you to look at, I want you to see here. Remember, I said this is an extra support for you to dive deeper into this content. But if we're really looking at functional behavior analysis, right, and you want to learn a lot about this, because as an inclusive teacher in early childhood, you're going to be dealing with exceptionalities or special needs who maybe have behavior or challenging behaviors that you are going to have to support them. I would really like you to understand how to conduct the functional behavior analysis. What does that approach and framework look like? How do I conduct this? How do I gather my data? So this is really going to help you. So I gave you a link to an IRIS module that I really encourage you to go look at, because this is going to really break down for you what is a functional behavior assessment. What does it look like? What is my part as a teacher? How do I actually conduct it and gather data? How do I make a hypothesis statement? So this is a great resource for you. So please go watch it. Now, once we've done all this and we gathered our data and we completed the functional behavior assessment, now you and your team have to put together a behavior intervention plan. Now remember, this can only be completed once you have gathered your data, you did your ABC analysis, you have your functional behavior assessment, and you have everything you need, your hypothesis statements complete. Now, you are going to put some plans in place. What is specifically in a behavior intervention plan? Well, the essential components have to be prevention strategies, right? These have to be implemented before time so you can heed off that challenging behavior to make sure that trigger is not effective. The skills, what skills are you going to teach them? What replacement behaviors are you going to put in place? How is that child going to do it? Who's going to support that child? In what areas and teacher's job is it to make sure you teach that skill? Think about the child's developmental level and their exceptionality. Do they understand what you want? How are you going to teach it to them? How are you going to model this for them? And then the consequences, you're specifically looking at how will adults respond to these behaviors. So you have to have a plan. And remember, your consequence needs to match the function of the behavior. Going back to little Mary, when she hits her peers on the face with the block or on the arm, and the teacher comes and scolds her and takes the students away, she's getting what she wants. So that's not a consequence strategy. You have to make sure it matches the function of the behavior. Okay, and here's an example that really shows you of how you'd put a planning chart in place that all teachers that work with Tim would understand. So you have the trigger, right? So why this is happening, what happens before, what the behavior actually is. To obtain something is what his is. What's the matching consequence? How are we going to maintain it? The preventions put in place, new skills you're going to teach the student, and then the new responses to the behaviors, right? Okay, so now after you got done with those 2 lessons, you have 2 assignments on how I'm going to assess you this week. The first one is going to be your discussion activity. So I have a discussion for you, and you also have a Module 6 quiz. So remember, you have 2 weeks to do this. So let's talk real quick about the discussion activity. So whenever we have children who are displaying challenging behaviors, sometimes we have what we call a fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, so this is an activity I put together for you that I think will help you understand challenging behaviors, and then give you an idea to think about other things that you might be experiencing in an early childhood classroom, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to begin this activity by watching this video called The Effects of Stress on a Child's Development. Now, this is one of the things we talked about in our lesson, how the environment and the stress that the child's in can sometimes make these challenging behaviors more aggressive. It could have more problems for the child, and there could be more triggers because of this. So what you're going to do is you're going to watch the video, and then you're going to read through this. Okay, there's a PowerPoint that talks about how you as a teacher can understand and respond to adverse children and their experiences that they're having. And it's going to talk about traumatized children specifically, okay, and what are those common triggers for them. There are 7, but I want you to only choose one of them. And then what you're going to do is you're going to answer these questions, right? So here's a form that can help you post information on the discussion board, but I want you to think about you as a teacher, how you might minimize your teaching practice the possibility of that trigger happening, right? And there's a rubric here to explain it to you, and then you're going to go to the fight, flight, or freeze module 6. So remember, you're watching the video, you're going to go through the PowerPoint on the triggers, and I want you to only focus on one of them, right? So children are going to respond by doing these kinds of things: fight, flight, or freeze. You're going to identify which strategy to address for each of these responses. So even though you're choosing one of those triggers, you still need to address fight, flight, or freeze. And I want you to specifically identify a strategy that's going to help with fight, flight, or freeze. Okay? So remember, guidelines for this is really going to be useful in the PowerPoint. So that's why I say make sure you go through the PowerPoint after you watch the video. And then, of course, you have your quiz. All right, guys, the quiz will close and your discussion board is due on November 5th. So you've got 2 weeks to do it. Remember, you do have extra time to complete Module 5 since it locked you out for a little bit. That's due on the 25th now, not on Sunday the 22nd. But guys, I hope that you have a great couple of weeks. And remember, if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out. And I want to remind you once again, please be working on your field experience videos. Okay, and if you have any questions or you need to set up a Teams meeting or call my office, please feel free to reach out. All right, guys, until next time, take care.